Well, good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, I'm going to be talking about your favorite subject, mine too, root disease, which is a very common phenomenon. If you have forested property, chances are you have some type of root disease happening somewhere. There are numerous different root diseases out there. I'm going to talk about 4 today, and these are the 4 that I see most often and that I see most often causing problems for landowners. Root diseases are caused by fungal pathogens, so these are fungal decay organisms. And diseases are not inherently bad. You know, in nature, things just simply are, and there are plant animal species that are adapted to those things. Whether or not something is bad is going to be determined through the lens of our objectives. From a purely natural standpoint, disease can have an ecological role. If we think about how forest stands develop, and in the earlier stages of development, we get into that crowded stem exclusion stage, like that photo on the left that shows all of those skinny, dense trees, high competition, high potential for mortality. Trees are stressed, low quality wildlife habitat. If you insert a disease pocket into that, that's going to bring more light to the forest floor. It's going to create openings. It's going to create snags and down logs, which are important for 40% of our vertebrate wildlife species, just depend on dead wood. You're going to end up with a different species mix, multi-layered canopy, and so forth. So you can see the photo on the right there, we have a much more diverse forest. There's a gap, an opening there in the forest with lots of light and heavy understory brush. Now, if your forest are the 2 trees in your front yard and they're both leaning toward your house and they have root disease, that could be a big problem and conflict with your objectives. And similarly, if you are managing, especially Douglas-fir stands for timber production, and you have root disease pockets, that's going to conflict with your objectives. And you may decide that management action to try and mitigate the disease is warranted. So what does root disease look like on the ground? Now, the first 3 root diseases that I'm going to talk about occur primarily in pockets, so localized disease centers, we would call these. And we can refer to these diseases as diseases of the site because they're present in the soil, and really not the soil itself per se, but rather in the residual infected material of previously infected trees. If you notice an opening in the forest, you might want to explore that if you're like me and say, okay, why is that opening here? If nature doesn't tolerate a vacuum, why do we have this gap? And you might walk in there and see something like this if it's a root disease pocket. Trees falling in all different directions. You know, if we think of a wind event, all the trees are going to go over in one direction. A big gust of wind takes them all over in one direction. Here, though, in this photo, we see trees falling all different directions and making that crisscross or jackstrawed pattern there. And that's indicative of root disease because it's just a random tree fall over time. Now, just because all the trees are going over in one direction does not mean it is purely a wind event. A root disease pocket plus a big wind event can also cause the trees to go over in one direction. But if you see this pattern of all different directions, that's a pretty good indication that it's root disease. You'll also notice that the trees that are down have no root wads. I'm sure all of you have seen trees that go over and they peel up that huge root wad, that big wide plate of roots, and they make a little pit. Underneath them oftentimes fills with water there, and that's a soil failure. All the roots are intact, but when you see them go over like this, where there's just stubs where the major roots used to be attached. So we see those stubs on the photo on the left and on the photo on the right, and we see that it's hollow going up in there where the decay has occurred. And I think those stubs sometimes look like little knuckles at the end, at the base of what used to be the tree. And we have a question about a shelf fungus. Yes, you probably did spot a shelf fungus there on the last slide, probably indicative of stem decay, in addition to the root disease. You also might see these beauties, stress cones. And this is a product of the prioritization of resources in trees when resources become limiting. First priority for the tree is maintain living tissue, then find root and leaf production, because that's going to help the tree to garner more resources, limiting resources of light, water, and nutrients. And then you see reproduction as a relatively high priority for the tree. So if the tree senses that it's on its way out, it may try to make one last hurrah for reproduction, which is biological success for an organism, before it meets its untimely demise. Notice how in these photos of these two dead trees with lots of cones on them, that the cones are small. They're not well formed. And that's indicative of stress cones. Sometimes it's just a good cone year. So if you see a tree that's laden with lots of cones, it doesn't necessarily mean that tree is stressed or having any problems. It may just be a good cone year, which is cyclical. But if they're small, and usually if they're stress cones, they're also going to occur in combination with other symptoms, yellowing foliage, thinning crown, and so forth, then it's a better indication that they're stress cones. Now around that opening where trees were standing, but now they're on the ground, you might see what we see in the photo on the left there, standing dead trees or snags, trees that have died from the disease but have not yet fallen over. And then beyond that, we see trees like in the photo on the right there, where the crowns are very thin, the foliage is sparse, and it's yellowing, we call chlorosis. And note how the thinning of the crowns is uniform. It's throughout the crown. It's not like a top-down mortality pattern or a bottom-up or an inside-out or outside-in like you would see with other types of damage from insects or drought, freeze damage, and that sort of thing. But it's a uniform fade of the crown. So you might see kind of this expanding pattern of decline from trees gone, trees dead but still there, trees looking sick, and then beyond that you may find healthy trees. Another thing that you might see, and you can see this in both the snags on the left, you can see my mouse there, and in the sick looking trees on the right, that the tops are kind of domed, rounded tops, as opposed to the really nice erect tops that we would usually associate with trees like this, which are Douglas-fir. And that goes back to the previous slide here, where when trees are running out of resources because their roots are compromised, can't take up enough water and nutrients, the first thing, the lowest priority there is diameter growth and resistance to insects and diseases, and then height, branch, and root growth. So as resources become more and more limited, the height growth is going to start to decrease. So each year that height growth increment is going to get shorter and shorter, which creates that rounded appearance. That doesn't always happen, but it is one of the things that I look for if I'm trying to determine if there might be root disease present in a stand. So as I mentioned, these are localized phenomenon, diseases of the site. And for our two most common, most damaging root diseases, laminated root rot and Armillaria, which I'll talk about momentarily, these spread primarily through underground root-to-root contact. So under the soil, as trees' root systems expand, they come in contact with one another and can even graft together. Here in this photo, we see kind of an illustration of a horizontal profile of a root disease pocket. The black roots represent uninfected roots and the red roots represent infected roots. So there in the middle, we see there's just some stumps. That's the center of the pocket there where the trees decayed to the point where they fell over. And then beyond that, we see some snags, also with infected roots. To the right there, to the left, we see some young trees that have come in. And as those tree roots start to grow into the decaying root systems of the infected trees that have fallen, they too become infected. And then if we follow to the right there past the snags, we see a tree that's got some yellowing on it. It's in the throes of infection, but has not yet died. And then that far tree on the right, notice how at the bottom, just its few roots on that side nearest to its sick neighbor are infected, but it hasn't yet spread across the entire root system. So it's in the early stages of infection and probably not showing any crown symptoms yet. You can see these outward spreading root disease pockets from the air. And you see these circles here, this on the landscape, this one down here in the lower left, we see that it's looks like a very young patch, shrubby, brushy, different types of trees. Looks like lighter green, might be some hardwoods in there compared to the standing coniferous forest around it. Up here, we see this these irregular kind of blobs where you see gray around the margins. Those are dead snags there, defining the margin of that. And then in the middle, we see that like down here, trees are starting to fill in there and replace those, backfill that. So sometimes these are more noticeable from the air even than they are on the ground. If a tree falls, is it root disease or soil failure? Well, again, if you see this big giant root plate, and notice that in addition to the major roots, it's still got the fine roots attached, which are going to be the first to decay in a root disease situation. That's a pretty good indicator that it's a soil failure. Contrast that to the stubby root wad on the other photos where there's hardly anything left. In this photo here, we see it's got a massive root plate. But in the center, at the very bottom here where I'm moving my mouse, you see looks like some white there. And I've blown that up here in the photo in the lower right, and we can see some white decayed spongy kind of material here. This tree was actually in the early stages of a Heterobasidion infection. So in this case, it was both root disease and soil failure. And you may see a situation where if the edge of the root zone is infected, it may hinge up on that as those early roots fail. And by soil failure, I mean it's a mechanical failure of the soil's ability to hold up the tree. And so you're going to see this on really shallow soils where there just isn't much soil there and it can just peel up when the tree is levered over by wind. Oftentimes, if you'll see these, the pits left behind by these upturned root wads fill with water. So it was wet soil, and again, that tree, you see the soil that's attached to the roots, but it didn't attach to the rest of the soil profile, and it just flips over like that. Another thing to keep in mind with root disease is that it may attract secondary agents. So there may be other things at work. So think back again to that list of resource priorities, and the lowest priority is insect and disease resistance. So if a tree is compromised from something like root disease, it's going to be limited in resources because its roots can't take up the resources that it needs. And then it's going to become weakened, which makes it susceptible to things like bark beetles. In Western Washington, our bark beetles tend to be opportunistic. They're going to go after trees that are not healthy, vigorous trees, but trees that are already weakened by something else, like laminated root rot or another root disease, or drought damage, or some combination thereof. In this case, this was a property in South Snohomish County, and there in the photo on the left, we see the tree stem with all those little white blobs. Those are fungal fruiting bodies, what we call conchs there, indicating a stem decay. There in the middle photo, we see a piece of bark peeled off the trees, and we see those little patterns in there. Those are bark beetle galleries, and we can even see a few larvae there. And then on the right there, we see that this is in an opening where there's a gap surrounded by snags, surrounded by dead trees. So classic root disease pattern. So in this case, there was a root disease pocket, and the root disease caused mortality and weakened trees. And the freshly dead trees, or mostly dead trees, attracted the bark beetles, who came along for the ride in a free lunch, trees with low defenses. And the bark beetles brought in on their bodies spores of a stem decay fungus called pouch fungus that then puts its fruiting body out the beetle holes. So multiple things working together, but the underlying situation here is root disease. And those trees would be just as dead even without the beetles and the pouch fungus. So in this case, it's the beetles are present, yes, but it's not a bark beetle problem, it's a root disease problem. The four common root diseases that I'm going to talk about today are laminated root rot, Heterobasidion, formerly called annosus, Armillaria, and Schweinitzii. Now, laminated root rot is the most damaging root disease in coastal Douglas-fir forests. And here we see a photo of a stand that's got root disease. And when taking this photo, I'm standing in a gap, and we can see the snags, we can see the thinning crowns and so forth, and this area is starting to open up due to the root disease. And laminated root rot, which is caused by Coniferiporia sulphurascens, I just discovered its name changed. It used to be Phlinus sulphurascens, and before that it was Phlinus werii. But the latest name here is Coniferiporia sulphurascens, if I'm even saying that correctly. It causes the wood to delaminate on the annual rings. So on the photo there on the right, we see a chunk of wood, and you can see how it's coming apart in sheets along the annual rings. And then here we see in the photo on the left, a tree that's broken off, and in the center here, we can see that decay, and it looks very soft, and it is sloughing off in sheets there from the delamination. We often joke that this ought to be called delaminated root rot, but laminated it remains. Diseases and insects as well are host specific. So different trees are going to have different levels of susceptibility to different diseases. In the case of laminated root rot, the most highly susceptible species are Douglas-fir, grand-fir, and mountain hemlock. And this is why this is the most damaging root disease here in coastal Western Washington Douglas fir forest in Oregon because it prefers Douglas fir and is very aggressive against Douglas fir. Intermediately susceptible species are going to be Western Hemlocks, Sitka spruce, other true firs like Pacific silver fir, noble fir, subalpine fir, and larch, both Western and subalpine larch. And so these aren't as susceptible as Douglas fir and grand fir, for instance, but they are susceptible to disease and may be affected, especially if they're growing together with the more highly susceptible species like Douglas fir and grand fir. Pines are tolerant of the disease. So lodgepole pine, western white pine, and then western red cedar is actually resistant. And trees that are not bothered by this disease, on the conifer side, we have Pacific yew, and then hardwood species are actually immune to laminated root rot. So keep this species list in mind, as one of the key strategies for managing this is to replace susceptible species with less susceptible species. So going from your Douglas fir to maybe your pine or your cedar. For laminated root rot, fruiting bodies are rare. You will probably find them, if you do, on the undersides of downed trees, and they're kind of just a little crust there. So here we see in these photos that kind of brown mottled crust on those pieces of wood. And these fruiting bodies, that's what's going to distribute spores. But fruiting bodies and spores are not thought to be a major source of spread for laminated root rot. Root-to-root contact is the primary method of spread. Rarely will spores be successful, but that's where you're going to get a new root disease pocket opening up if spores are successful, but that's rare. Most of the spread is through root-to-root contact. Other signs you might see on the stump, you might see an irregular stain, like in the photo on the upper left there, we see that dark kind of blotchy stain, but notice it's in the outer wood, the sapwood. So the stain is in the sapwood of the tree as opposed to the heartwood. There on the lower left, we see a piece of wood that's got kind of a crud layer on it. We call this ectotrophic mycelium. So fungi are made up of tiny filaments called hyphae, and those filaments may form mats called mycelium. And ectotrophic mycelium just means that it's occurring on the outside of the tree roots. And that's one of the ways that it's going to spread from root to root, is where two roots cross over one another, that ectotrophic mycelium can grow off of an infected root onto an uninfected root. The delaminated wood, it's going to be very lightweight, almost like balsa wood that you'd use for like a model airplane, balsa wood airplane. And you'll see that it's pitted, and there's the pits are fairly round, as you can see in that photo on the right, all those little black pits. Also, what you might see, which I don't have pictured here, are these reddish brown tufts of fibers called setal hyphae. And you may need a hand lens to actually see those if you look up close on the decayed wood. But when you see those little red whiskers, that's a good indication of laminated root rot. We looked in previous slides at the crown symptoms of thinning crown, yellowing crown, snags, and so forth. Those do not always occur or are not always readily visible, which can be a real problem. You may have a tree that looks perfectly healthy, and then on a still summer day, suddenly it falls over and you look and the root system has been completely rotted away, and you're sort of like, how is this tree even alive? So keep that in mind, that the trees may not show obvious symptoms. But these are signs that you might want to look for. And symptoms, that's how the tree manifests the disease, what's happening to the tree, whereas signs are the pathogen itself. So in this case, like the setal hyphae or the ectotrophic mycelium and such. So lots of different things to look for. So we come down to the question of, what do we do about it? What are the management options? Well, this is going to depend on your objectives. If you want to mitigate the disease, you're probably going to have to go in there and remove all the host species in the infected area. And you want to try to find the boundary of an infection center. Try and find the last trees showing symptoms, with the yellowing, thinning crowns, and then go a couple trees beyond that, assuming that those trees are in the early stages of infection, just not showing symptoms yet. So it's just like excising a cancerous tumor. You want a clean margin around that. So you want at least a 50-foot buffer between the apparent limits of the disease. And within that, take out all of the host species. So your true firs, your hemlocks, and your Douglas-firs. In root disease pockets, it's already going to be filling in with resistant or immune species like maple and cedar. And if you can, leave those seedlings or saplings, as that way you have a jump on the regeneration in that area. Removing these trees, replanting with less susceptible species, again, hardwoods, pines, cedar, that's kind of the #1 recommendation for dealing with these. If you really wanted to grow Douglas fir, you could get an excavator and come in and rip out all the stumps to try and reduce the amount of infected material that's in the soil there to minimize the chance of reinfection when you plant host species, new Douglas fir seedlings on top of that. There are long-term studies that show that this is effective, but it is kind of a scorched earth approach. It's expensive, lots of soil disturbance, and so forth. What I typically tell people is that laminated root rot is nature's way of telling you to grow more cedar, to diversify. So yes, you could pull the stumps, but I don't think that's a real practical or realistic option. That infected material can persist on that site for about 50 years before those old stumps and root systems fully decay. And if there are no new host species growing there after 50 years, that disease will burn out because it'll run out of food. And after that point, then Douglas fir or grand fir could be replanted on that site. So on a laminated root rot site, maybe you do 2 30-year rotations of alder or a 60-year rotation of cedar before you come back to a species like Douglas fir. There's also nothing inherently wrong with simply tolerating it, letting it do its thing. Let the openings backfill with resistant species, enjoy the wildlife that it brings. So it's going to be determined by your objectives, including safety, your preferred aesthetics, your production objectives, and so forth. And as far as how fast this spreads, it's going to depend on different variables, the density of the stand, the vigor of the stand, the species mix that's present, and so forth. But a good rule of thumb is about 1 foot per year expanding outward, and expect your tree losses to double about every 15 years. Moving on to another damaging root disease, Armillaria. And this is a wide-ranging root disease. It's found all over the world, and it can infect just about every species. And Armillaria is a genus name. It's a collection of different fungal species. The primarily damaging one that we have here in Washington is Armillaria ostoyei. Probably butchered the pronunciation there. But it can affect lots of different species. Grand fir and inland Douglas fir, so eastern Washington Douglas fir, are the most susceptible to Armillaria. On the west side, most species have a moderate susceptibility to Armillaria. Douglas fir starts to grow out of its susceptibility once it gets into its 20s. When it gets beyond 25 years old, it becomes less and less susceptible to Armillaria. So young west side Douglas fir, hemlock, even cedar, pines, the other true firs, spruce, and hardwoods like black cottonwood, especially in Oregon white oak, can be bothered by Armillaria. Other hardwoods like alder, maple, cherry, and conifers like larch and yew are rarely bothered. They can be susceptible, but are seldom damaged. And for hardwood species, it actually may be a different species of Armillaria that's a bigger player than the main one here that I can't pronounce. Armillaria is one of the easier root diseases to diagnose because it's got lots of different symptoms and signs. One of the symptoms we see here in the photo on the left is a bunch of what we call a basal resin flow or resin soaking. So the base of the tree is leaking pitch, and it can give it a really wet, dark, soaked appearance, or here we see the pitch is crusty and white. Under the bark, it forms these mycelial fans. So you can see that in the upper right photo here, and notice how this is coming out in a nice fan shape here. And these are kind of rubbery. If you've ever like peeled latex paint off a wall that didn't adhere very well, it kind of has that texture to it. And then around the base of the tree, this doesn't have conchs, those bracket fungi, but its fruiting bodies are mushrooms, which are generally edible, Armillaria, and called honey mushrooms because of their light tan appearance. So we see some of those mushrooms growing around the roots of an infected tree there in the photo on the lower right. Another interesting thing that Armillaria has are these specialized structures called rhizomorphs. So in these two images here, we see these black threads that really, they look like fine tree roots, but that is the fungus. And this is why another name for Armillaria is shoestring fungus, because these little strings. So in addition to the root-to-root contact spread underground, just like laminated root rot, Armillaria can cheat. Even when there's not another root there, it can send out its little rhizomorphs there in search of host material to infect. Now here's some fun facts about Armillaria. You may have heard of the humongous fungus in the Blue Mountains of Northeast Oregon. That is an Armillaria root disease center, and it covers several square miles. It's the largest organism by area that we know of. All one individual organism, massive patch of Armillaria. Also, if you've ever heard of foxfire, this is where you can see some glowing and decaying stumps or some mushrooms in the forest, because some species of fungi have a bioluminescence, and Armillaria is one of those. As far as rate of spread for Armillaria, it's a pretty big range. It can go from less than a foot to more than 4 feet per year, depending on the species, the tree age, and the location. Armillaria is much more damaged in drier areas. It's much more damaging east of the Cascades than it is west of the Cascades. As far as management strategies, Armillaria is associated with low vigor trees. So there's an element to Armillaria that's opportunistic. So maintaining tree vigor is a really good management strategy. Like laminated root rot, changing over to less susceptible species is probably the best long-term plan. So this means, if you have older Douglas fir forests, that's probably going to be okay. On the east side, you might want to get away from Douglas fir. On both sides, you want to get away from grand fir and go for some of those lesser damaged species, especially the hardwood species like alder and maple. Although I do see hardwood species get attacked by Armillaria. In fact, one of those photos of the rhizomorphs on a previous slide was actually from a big leaf maple that went down in the along Highway 20 in the North Cascades. For all of these root diseases, in general, you want to avoid commercial thinning. And that may seem counterintuitive when we want to increase tree vigor. But thinning or partially harvesting can actually exacerbate the disease. For remaining infected species, because a fast growth burst is going to cause their root systems to expand even wider and come in contact with more other trees. And also the trees that are infected that you cut, to some degree, the tree's defense chemicals are working to keep that disease at bay. But if you suddenly kill the tree, those chemicals disappear and the entire root system of that tree is very rapidly colonized and can facilitate more spread. So commercial thinning is typically something to avoid. It does not help to mitigate the disease. Now, pre-commercial thinning is a different story. Early in the life of the stand, if you pre-commercial thin to maintain vigor, you're taking out small material, you're not going to do a lot of residual damage to the other trees that could weaken them. And you're also causing the live trees to be spaced wider apart, so less opportunity for root systems to come in contact with one another. So early pre-commercial thinning, great, but as the stand gets older, I suggest avoiding thinning or any sort of partial harvest. You may need to do a clear cut or patch cut to address that disease. Especially, if you've got more than 20% infection in a stand and it's older trees, really you're looking at kind of a reboot of that stand and replanting with different species. All right, Heterobasidion. Now this is a root and bud disease. And this is the root disease formerly known as annosus. So it's undergone some species differentiation and clarification over the last few years. So we used to attribute this to Heterobasidion annosum. And Heterobasidion, this is the most common damaging root disease throughout the whole northern hemisphere. And so they have species in Europe and Asia, as well as North America. So Heterobasidion annosum was split into 5 different identified distinct species. 3 are Eurasian species, and then 2 are North American species. Heterobasidion occidentale and Heterobasidion irregulare are 2 North American species. Both occur here in Washington, and they're distinguished by their hosts. So Heterobasidion occidentale goes after your firs and your hemlocks, whereas your Heterobasidion irregulare goes after pines. And it's the hemlocks, the true firs, as opposed to the Douglas fir, and the pines that are the primary hosts of this disease. So grand fir, Pacific silver fir, and mountain hemlock are particularly susceptible, Western hemlock, especially older hemlocks, can start to accumulate a lot of damage from this disease. Lodgepole pine, ponderosa pine, and our other true firs, noble fir and subalpine fir, are moderately susceptible. I mostly see this in the wild in Western hemlock. If I find a hemlock with root disease, most of the time it's going to be Heterobasidion. Douglas fir, cedar, Western white pine, and spruce are rarely bothered by this disease. And Pacific yew is not susceptible. There are some hardwood trees that are susceptible. Maple, big leaf maple is an example of that. Most hardwoods are not. The best way to identify Heterobasidion is by its fruiting bodies. This is a tricky disease because often there are no crown symptoms. The crown will look perfectly healthy. And this is a disease that doesn't really cause mortality, doesn't kill the tree, but can cause extensive decay in the roots and the butt. And so typically what's going to happen is the tree is going to be subject to wind throw or wind snap breakage. And that's what's going to happen there. Hemlock especially is notorious for not having any symptoms associated with this disease, but the fruiting bodies are pretty distinctive. So there in the photo on the left, we see some bracket fungi on an old stump, and it's kind of a leathery, dark brown gray on top, and then it's a creamy white porous surface underneath. And if you can see, I'm gonna kind of hover my mouse over that. You've got that kind of lighter, it's a very, oops, went too far. It's a smooth edge there, front edge to that, or what we call a sterile margin. And oftentimes, living trees, these will grow in crotches between roots, as we see here in the photo on the right. This is a hemlock tree, and it's got some of those bracket conchs there right in the crotch of those roots, and it's right down there at the duff level, so it may be hard to spot on the surface. Another thing is that Heterobasidion often occurs together with laminated root rot and or Armillaria. And those other root diseases may actually mask the presence of the Heterobasidion. So really those fruiting bodies are how you would tell mostly if you have an infected tree. Unlike the previous two diseases where the primary spread is through root-to-root contact, this is an airborne disease spread by spores that can land on wounds and cut stumps. Even very small wounds, little nicks in the roots and so forth, can cause new infections. So the spores are ubiquitous in the air. Any sort of damage or wound is going to get in there. And those infections may be latent. It may just kind of stay there localized in that spot and not spread until the tree is stressed or there's some incident that then causes it to spread, or it may immediately become an active decay infection. So avoiding wounding. So there you see on the photo on the right there, a tree that's got dinged up by some logging that happened around it. You really got to avoid wounding to avoid Heterobasidion. So if you've got hemlock trees and there's Heterobasidion, you know, this is an area where you really have to be cautious in doing things like commercial thinning. So avoiding wounding, that's a primary management strategy. Just don't let it get into the tree. Root-to-root contact can occur, but it's secondary, and it can create those root disease centers. But it has been noticed that Heterobasidion can occur in these pockets, like there might be a dead stump and then infected trees around. But there are some questions about whether that was root-to-root contact from that old infected tree or stump, or if it was, say, Armillaria or laminated root rot that was causing the pocket phenomenon, and Heterobasidion just happened to be occurring as individuals in some of those trees. So what research has found is that if you go into a stand that has trees infected by Heterobasidion, they're not the same organism. It's not like the clonal clump you would see with Armillaria laminated root rot, where it's the same individual fungus that's infecting the area, but each tree is infected with its own individual, unique individual. Literature reports that they can spread at 1.5 to 3 feet per year. But again, is this an issue of the Heterobasidion actually spreading root to root, or is it more of an issue of there's another disease present that's causing that part of the phenomenon? Treating the stumps with borax, you can see the photo on the upper left there, someone's shaking that white borax powder on a stump, is effective at preventing freshly cut stumps from becoming infected. And there used to be the worry that spores would fall on these cut stumps, the stump would become infected, and then live tree roots would come in contact with that root system and it would be spread that way. More the thinking now is that yes, those stumps are an issue, but not because of root-to-root contact, but because then a whole bunch of those fruiting bodies will flourish on that stump, and it'll increase the spore loading of that localized area. So a whole bunch more spores in the air, which means a whole bunch more opportunities for other trees to be infected through large or small wounds. And it's only effective if that tree is not already infected with the disease. So if it is infected, you might see what we see in the lower left there. We see that staining. And unlike the laminated root rot stain, here we see it's a blotchy, irregular stain, but it's on the edges of the heartwood, not out in the sapwood. So again, implications for thinning, just like with the other diseases, thinning, those stumps could become infected if they're not already and spread more spores, or especially the collateral damage issue with thinning, causing wounding that can spread the disease. And on trees that are infected, thinning out those trees, that disease is now going to spread more rapidly through that root system, more fruiting bodies. You get the idea. So thinning in general is not a good strategy for managing root disease. It's kind of been a myth for a while, but we're finding that that's less and less appropriate. Advanced decay for Heterobasidion, it can get really kind of wet and spongy and stringy. And here in the photo on the right, we see a close-up of this spongy stringy wood, and notice how it's got the white streaks in it, and also the two red arrows are pointing to those black flecks, which are kind of the size of rice grains. So that's a good indication of Heterobasidion. Delamination can also occur, and this is going to happen in true firs and pines. The initial decay may be laminated, just like with laminated root rot. It's going to have pitting, elongated pits on only one side of those delaminating sheets, though. Again, Heterobasidion doesn't usually cause mortality. It's a growth loss, and loss to wind is the major issue. Most damage from Heterobasidion is in eastern Washington, and it's in stands that have had lots of harvest entries, or in older hemlock stands where the disease kind of accumulates in hemlocks. Stands that have had lots of entries, it means there's lots of collateral damage and wounding that's been happening over time. So strategies: shift to less susceptible species, avoid wounds. You can treat those stumps if they're not already infected. It may prevent them from becoming a host, spreading more spores, and avoid the commercial thinning or the partial harvest. But again, PCT is okay. Get good spacing and vigor early in the life of the stand. Now, just a quick wrap up here. I don't have a whole lot to say about Schweinitzii. It's kind of a fun one. Now, it's primarily a butt rot, and one of the names for it is actually brown cubical butt rot, which always makes kids giggle, adults too sometimes. And this is also called cow pie or velvet top fungus. So here in the photo on the right, this is a fresh conch, and see it's got that red velvety-like texture on top. And then in the upper left, we see a conch that's died and is decaying, and it looks just like a little cow pie or a meadow muffin. And then there in the lower left, you can see why this is called a brown cubical rot, because the way the wood decays is it breaks into blocks. This is mostly an issue with Douglas-fir and Sitka spruce. Doesn't really bother other species that much. And another symptom that you might see is basal swelling. So notice here we have a Douglas-fir that broke off right there at the top. So we've got a kind of a tall stump, and see the swelling at the base here? That's an indicator of Schweinitzii. And this is kind of a tree by tree management issue. If you start to notice those fungal conks, good idea to have an arborist come out and take a look, because I think yes, you can have mortality and growth loss, but I think safety is probably the big issue with Schweinitzii. So that's all I have. If you need to get back to work, I wish you a very pleasant good afternoon, but I am happy to stick around here and take any questions that Brendan hasn't addressed already. So Brendan, what do you got for me?
Well, there's these two at the end that I left. So the first one is, can any of these diseases be spread via logging equipment?
Not that I'm aware of. That's not something that I've ever seen in the literature about being an issue. There are some diseases like Port Orford cedar root disease, for instance, where that can be a method of spread, but not in these.
Yeah. I suppose the one caveat would be if your loggers are leaving wounds in your trees, especially with Heterobasidion, they might create vectors for it to infect the tree.
Yeah, again, the air is just full of spores. If the temperature is above freezing and it's not super hot and dry, that fungus is going to be actively sporulating, spreading its spores.
And then, okay, so we were advised that 2 to 3 of our Douglas fir trees were killed by Phytophthora root rot. I was surprised this was not in the top 4. Is it likely something else was wrong?
Not necessarily. Again, there are many root diseases out there. These are the 4 that I see most common in forested settings.
Yes, Phytophthora that I've run into is generally more of a horticultural problem. It's not a true fungus, it's a water mold. And it needs to be in soils that are usually spend a lot of time being pretty inundated with water, and it actually spreads through that water in the soil. Uh, so it can be a problem occasionally in the wild. And again, like Armillaria, there's a lot of different species of Phytophthora, hundreds of different species. Uh, so I think we do have some native species here, but they tend to be fairly specific and they're not super widespread spread problems. Paul asks, I just removed a couple of Madrona with root rot. What is it? Or sorry, with rot, not root rot. What is it?
I have no idea.
Yeah, there's a few different bacterial and fungal pathogens that just kind of chronically infect madrone. We often get questions about what's killing all the madrone because every single one of them has gnarled, dying branches and cankers all over it. And that's just kind of what madrones do. I think historically they burned more often and just resprouted from their stumps. Uh, but yeah, that's just kind of how madrones often look, and eventually that might get into the heart and rot it out, and then often you'll get stump sprouts coming up from it.
A good resource on Madrone is our Madrone Research Center at WSU Puyallup. If you do an internet search for WSU Puyallup Madrone Research, you'll find that website. And that's got a lot of information on the diseases and damage specific to Madrone.
And I am linking that right now. Where were we? Do you recommend a good photo book on the subject?
There are a couple that I like. One is, if I can find it here. Here we go. It's called Field Guide to the Common Diseases and Insect Pests of Oregon and Washington Conifers. As far as I know, it's still out of print, but you can search online for this and you can get an archived PDF copy. The PDF is a little bit cumbersome since it's kind of like a scan of a 350-page book.
If you do a little digging, I found one that's actually a good quality PDF that's searchable.
Oh, great. Send that to me, would you?
Okay,
or
I
post it in
will.
the chat here
Yeah,
for
I
us.
can't remember where I found it, but it's a Forest Service publication, so you all already paid for it. You don't have to feel too bad about downloading the PDF.
The other one that I like is Common Tree Diseases of British Columbia. And that's another one where you can find a PDF online, or I think actually they have it as a website now, or you can download a PDF. That's a good one. The Forest Service's Forest Insect and Disease Leaflets is a whole publication series. Those have some good resources on this. Forest Service has a lot of good publications. So in the follow-up to this webinar, when we send out a link to the recording, I'm going to include some links to some good resources for follow-up reading and getting more photos of these types of diseases.
All right. We are noticing, this is from Gail, we're noticing sap drop seasonal with Douglas-fir. Any comments on that?
Can you, Gail, can you describe a little bit more? Are you talking about like pitch streamers running down the side of the tree randomly? Is it a place that's kind of gushing pitch, or what? If you can kind of clarify that for me, then I can come back to that.
All right. Can young trees less than 20 years old show symptoms of root rot?
Yes, they can. And if host species are planted in an area that, you know, an area where trees were cut that had, say, laminated root rot, those seedlings will become infected. There's not any sort of specific timetable as far as infection and decline. You can have seedlings that never make it past their 5th birthday. You might have others that can persist for a few decades before the disease gets an upper hand. But yes, even young seedlings can get root disease and die. You know, a broader management strategy issue that I didn't specifically address is that of keeping records. And this has been a real problem. I think that we see perhaps more root disease now because of past management history in this area. One being that we've done a lot of monoculture forestry, especially with Douglas fir. So that's really feeding the laminated root rot, and not paying attention to where root disease centers are. So just coming through, cutting everything, not marking or mapping out the areas that were diseased, and then just coming in and planting the host species right on top of it. It would, part of the way that nature mitigates this is that as these disease trees die out, resistant or immune species pop up and replace them. But what we've done with modern forest management is we keep force feeding the disease, getting it stronger and more widespread. And that's a problem.
All right. Dave asks, any guidance on Phytophthora?
Not off the top of my head, probably a good internet search would help. Or
Yes, again, that might.
the P&W Disease Management Handbook is where I would start for Phytophthora.
That would be good. Also, the master gardeners deal with Phytophthora more than we do because it is such a common horticultural issue in heavily watered gardens.
Yep.
But in a forest environment, the answer is probably going to come down to similar answers to the other root diseases, which is plant something that's resistant to it. Joseph linked some info on Phytophthora and Madrone.
Thanks, Joey.
Paul comments that the forester told him that madrone show rot by top-down dying. One was 4 feet across and had dead branches and some butt rot, but after we cut it, we realized it was healthy. And then asks, do wood piles attract fungus?
Do wood piles attract fungus? Well, wood is, you know, once wood is dead, it starts to decay by saprophytic fungi. it's not going to contribute to a disease problem, though. I think with firewood, if there's bark beetles present, that can be more of an issue with firewood, but not really from disease. And especially, if you're cutting firewood, it's going to dry out and not be subject to extensive decay. If we see in the forest, there's down trees all over the place, lots of dead wood, important part of the ecosystem, doesn't necessarily increase the disease load to any extent.
All right, we have a question. Is big leaf maple decline going to be an accepted diagnosis going forward for this tree? Why can't the cause of decline be pinpointed?
Probably. The reason that the cause can't be pinpointed is because it doesn't appear to be caused by any sort of organism. They've tested for every possible bacteria, virus, fungi, insect, mite, and so forth, and there's nothing showing up. And that indicates that it's environmental. And environmental is much harder to nail down. A UW study on big leaf maple decline found a correlation between the symptoms and proximity to develop and increase temperatures. So it's one of those things is we're not sure quite what the mechanism is, but we're pretty sure it's our fault. I think climate change with higher temperatures and droughtier summers is probably a big contributor to this.
Yeah, they did also test for a number of different common pollutants as well, and didn't find any answers there either. So,
Common, what did you say?
Pollutants.
Oh, pollutants, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, the short answer is why can't the cause of the decline be pinpointed is because we can't figure out what it is.
Yeah, there's nothing obvious that's showing up.
All right. So Noel Doherty asks, thank you very much for the presentation. The pests of native California conifers is very similar in regards to basically the same species.
Yep, Northern California, you're going to find a lot of this same stuff.
All right, and Gail clarified her question about the pitch dropping and pitch streaming. She says pitch from high branches dropping on the ground. Plants, whatever is under the Doug-fir seems to have a bit of pitch when we touch or step on it.
I wonder if that's honeydew.
Ooh, yeah, is it definitely pitch, Gale, or is it honeydew?
If it's sticky, it may be aphid type droppings.
Yes. So often when you park under a tree in a city and your car gets covered in that gunk that you can't wipe off the windshield.
All those little tiny droplets.
Yeah, that's the honeydew, the droppings from aphids. And it's a very sugary excrement. So it's possible it's a honeydew coming from either an adelgid or an aphid.
Ants will actually kind of raise aphids just for the production of that sugary honeydew. Fascinating, huh?
Yeah. But if you're seeing large chunks of it, and this is a fine mist that falls. So if you're seeing large chunks of something that smells like pitch from a conifer, then it's not honeydew.
Yeah, and typically when we see pitch dripping, it's from some sort of mechanical wound, either a little split in the bark, old pruning wound, or something like that.
Lori Beard, and Lori, I think you said you were a master gardener. She comments that if something has Phytophthora, it is fatal and needs to be removed. So if that's a possibility, then that's definitely a good answer. But often that's a more applicable solution in horticultural situations. Rose asks, does fire/burning, prescribed fire, or wildfire contribute to the spread of fungi or impact the way it spreads?
Not that I've read. It certainly doesn't contribute to the spread, but from what I've read about these different diseases, it also doesn't do anything to stop the spread.
All right. And We have a comment, be aware of pruning cuts, i.e. end length reductions, leaking resin usually over the property. Exactly. The pitch streams are often some sort of mechanical damage. If you live in a colder area, it could be a result of frost cracking on the trunk of the tree. Or just some trees seem to, when as they grow, they get little cracks in the, little sort of essentially stretch marks in their bark, the
I like
cracks
that,
that'll
stretch
pitch out.
marks.
Yeah. Uh, Sometimes trees just pitch out. Yeah, exactly, Lori. If you prune too deep into the branch collar. All right. Any other questions? Anyone who felt like we didn't quite address their question fully, want to clarify or add any more before we end here? Oh, and Kevin, we had a question earlier about whether or not you'd be sharing your slides.
I suppose if you asked nicely and say please, I could do that.
All right. We need a lot of pleases in chat.
Oh, I will send out the slides, not to worry.
All right. Fantastic. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
All right, and we wish all of you a very pleasant good afternoon.